Hello. Thank you for joining us this evening at the 20th anniversary edition of Hong Kong International Literary Festival. My name is Catherine Platt and I'm the festival director. We've already had 8 full days of online and hybrid events with 2 days left to go. Our closing weekend has a full schedule of live and online events. You can find us here on Crowdcast, and we'll also be at Asia Society Hong Kong Centre tonight and tomorrow morning, and then at Tai Kwun all day, Saturday and Sunday. You can visit our website, festival.org.hk, for full details of all our programming this weekend. We're delighted to be joined for this session by writer, historian, conservationist, and peace negotiator, Thant Myint-U, who will speak about his latest book, The Hidden History of Burma. He will be talking to Ian Holliday, and I will introduce Ian and hand over to him in just a minute. First of all, just a few housekeeping points about Crowdcast. Feel free to post comments in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen, as some people already are. But if you have a question for Thant, could you please click on the Q&A box down there in the bottom right where it says ask a question, and put your question in there. You'll also see a green button at the bottom of the screen which you can click to be connected to the website of our festival bookseller, Bookazine, to buy Thant's book. All of our authors appear in the festival for free, and the best way to thank them and support their work is to buy their books, and you can also support a local retailer here in Hong Kong. So the event will remain on Crowdcast until the end of November, so you can watch on demand anytime if you know other people who would like to see it. And we will also be adding Chinese subtitles within 2 to 3 days. So finally, I would just like to thank all of our cultural partners, sponsors and donors for their generous support, which makes these events possible. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language, Education and Research. And also a sincere thanks to Asia Society in Hong Kong for partnering with us on this free online event series. They are also broadcasting this session on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. Now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today's session, Professor Ian Holliday. He has been Vice President of Teaching and Learning at the University of Hong Kong since 2015. Previously, he was Dean of Social Sciences at Hong Kong U and Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at City University of Hong Kong. And his research focuses on Myanmar politics and governance. So I will hand over to Ian to introduce Thant. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks very much, Catherine. It's a great pleasure this evening to be introducing Thant Myint-U to our audience joining us through Crowdcast. Thant, as Catherine said, is a writer, historian and conservationist, a former presidential advisor and peace negotiator, chairman of U Thant House and Yangon Heritage Trust in Yangon, and a founding partner of the AVA Advisory Group. He was educated at Harvard and Cambridge universities, and for several years taught history as a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He served on 3 United Nations peacekeeping operations and as chief of policy planning in the UN's Department of Political Affairs. He's the author of 4 books on Burma, most recently, The Hidden History of Burma, Race, Capitalism, and the Crisis of Democracy in the 21st Century. He's here with me this evening to talk about that book. Thant, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very good to see you.
Welcome. Yes, thank you. So The Hidden History of Burma. What is that hidden history, and why has it remained hidden until you wrote about it at the end of last year in 2019?
Well, when I first thought about the book in 2015, I thought that it was going to be more or less an insider account of the previous several years. I had been part of some of the change that had happened in the country in the exit from military dictatorship, and then we saw the end of sanctions, we saw political liberalization, and I thought it was going to be a political history of the country. And I actually had a separate title at that point. But then when I started writing the book in 2017, I realized that there were other issues, especially around ethnic conflict, identity, questions of citizenship and belonging. We had the violence in Rakhine state, the expulsion and exodus of over 700,000 people to Bangladesh. We had fighting in other parts of the country that weren't going away despite the peace process. And so I felt I had to talk about that. And then I started thinking of that as a kind of hidden history and the ways in which identity issues were rooted in Burma or Myanmar's colonial past and colonial and post-colonial context as well. But then the more that I started talking to people and thinking and reflecting about where Myanmar was in the late 20-teens, I began to realize that there was this other hidden history, even more hidden history, around the political economy of the country and the ways in which the colonial political economy had evolved, how it was there was an attempt to substitute for that with a left-wing or a series of left-wing socialist programs after independence. And then the evolution of this very strange capitalist economy in Myanmar since 1988. So in a way, for me, that the hidden history is the way in which all of these things interact, but especially this last emphasis on the political economy of the country.
Thanks. Your other 3 books have been translated into Burmese. If this one gets a Burmese edition, which I'm sure it will, would it also be a hidden history for Burmese people, for your compatriots, or might it be a little bit more familiar to them than it is to us on the outside?
No, I think that's a really good question. I think that I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the title would be, but I think it would be still a hidden history in a way, or a history of the past that people don't know, for a couple of different reasons. I mean, for people outside the country, of course, many readers won't be familiar with Burmese history. But I think for people inside the country, especially for young people, because history is not taught properly or almost at all in schools, a lot of this kind of deeper history, but even the history of anything beyond the last 10 years is often not well known. Certainly not the colonial history, the ways in which identity issues were formulated under colonial rule and how they evolved. And even the economic history, even though that's sort of the lived experience of most people in the country, and they understand the economic system around them to some extent, I think people both inside and outside have always framed modern Burmese history around around explaining the military dictatorship and the last 30 years around the contest between Burma's generals and Aung San Suu Kyi. And I think that's how people inside the country also see it. And I just want to kind of not challenge that as not important, but add these other dynamics as well, which I think are critical in understanding where we are today and where we might go in the future as well.
So in both answers, you've addressed the colonial encounter. And that's also, of course, the key theme of your first book, The Making of Modern Burma. So why, I mean, the point that you make is that encounter set the parameters for national politics right down to today. So why has that been so enduring? I mean, we all know about path dependency and all of that, but we're going back more than a century. We're going back 150 years in some respects. Why has Burma not been able to kind of cast off that experience in the post-independence era?
Well, I think for countries all over the world, I mean, colonialism is still a living thing in the sense that I think the shadow of colonialism and the hundreds of years of colonialism are still all around us in different ways. I think in the Myanmar case or in the Burma case, it's particularly acute because Burma was annexed to India. It was a particularly radical form of colonialism in the sense that all Burmese institutions of government, and many social institutions were deliberately cast aside or destroyed or decayed over the decades of the late 19th century when British rule was at its peak. And it was a particularly exploitative political economy under colonialism as well, where Burma was exploited for its natural resources, for its rice economy, and also where millions of Indians, ethnic Indians from the rest of the British Indian Empire came into Myanmar. And so Burmese nationalism, or the nationalism of the ethnic Burmese majority, grew up around or during this period of massive Indian immigration. And I think that evolution of Burmese politics around this time of uncontrolled immigration under a foreign occupation, when Burma was a racial hierarchy, is a kind of dynamic that really is at the very core of the Burmese political DNA even now. And I think casts a shadow not only around kind of Burmese nationalist thinking, but also in terms of how they interact with other peoples and other minorities in the country since independence as well. This is all not to say that, colonialism or the British are responsible for everything. Certainly not. I mean, Burma's been independent for over 70 years, and I think there's a whole cast of characters within Burma that are to blame for a lot of the country's problems. But I think we have to understand the history of colonialism to really understand the ways in which the country's evolved and think about options for the future as well.
So race is highlighted as the first concept in the subtitle of the current book. And you've also addressed that already in your comments this evening. To what extent do you think there might have been an escape from that kind of colonial mindset coming into the 1950s? UNU and that whole democratic experience collapsed in 1962, and Ne Win, of course, was a real Burma nationalist who sought to entrench that way of seeing social relations inside the country. But do you think an escape might have been possible in those 14 brief years of the democratic interlude?
Yeah, I think I don't think anything was set in stone. I think that I think there are two layers of problems. I mean, I think the first is that Burmese nationalism grew up, as I mentioned before, in the 20s and 30s, seeing the Indians as outsiders and the British as outsiders. By the 1950s, the British had more or less left the country, and many of the ethnic Indians and their descendants who had come in had also left the country during World War II and afterwards, and then many were subsequently expelled in the 60s as well. And that's one set of issues and problems. But the second dynamic is something very different, because the Burmese nationalists, having kind of achieved what they wanted and being in control of the country in 1948, I think suddenly discovered that there were other peoples in the country as well that had not been really part of Burmese politics at the center in Rangoon, many living in the uplands, many who had been ruled only indirectly, if at all, by the British until the 1940s, people like the Shan or the Kachin, and that somehow they had to integrate them. And I think this challenge of a Burmese nationalism at the core, needing to kind of integrate other peoples in the country who had not been part of British Burma politics, I think has been a big challenge that the Burmese haven't really successfully managed to overcome. I think the other part of this is that there was a sort of socialist effort in the 50s, in a much more extreme way in the 60s and 70s, that failed, and we can discuss the different ways in which that failed, I think for a variety of reasons, not least by the 60s, because it was coupled with extreme isolation from the rest of the world as well. And I think it was partly, that the failure of the left to succeed in post-independence Burma that then left a kind of Burmese nationalism free and independent to kind of evolve in a certain direction. And because of the armed conflict and the brutality of the armed conflict, I think it evolved in a particularly exclusionary direction, and one that didn't benefit at all from either from academic exchange or from free debate over these past decades. So I think by the 2000s, it had been, I think, probably one of the biggest problems in the country's political stage.
And then when Burma kind of re-engaged with the world, it was in the age of Facebook, which after the liberalization in 2013 of telecoms, and suddenly everybody had a smartphone. I remember, going one time, no phones, the usual stuff. And then the next time my taxi driver's on the phone, people walking down the street are on the phone. I mean, it's a very rapid engagement with the world through Facebook and through the internet. People have laid a lot of blame at the door of Facebook for the crisis that was to come in Rakhine in 2017. What's your reading of that?
I think I think in a way, blaming Facebook or social media in general is slightly disingenuous, because I mean, this is a country that's had lots of problems before Facebook as well. I mean, if we're looking at interethnic violence, if we're looking at dictatorship, if we're looking at human rights abuses, if we're looking at hatred between ethnic groups and prejudices and everything else, and chauvinism, I mean, there was a lot of that before Facebook ever came on the scene as well. So I think that's important to understand. I think it is, in a way, it was in a way unhelpful for Burma's democratic transition, that exactly at the moment where a degree of free speech and freedom media was possible, that kind of traditional media outlets didn't have an opportunity to grow. And in 2011, 2012, dozens of different newspapers went up. There was a possibility of these traditional media institutions and organizations, including expat ones that were coming back into the country for the first time, for them to have a big role in the country's democratic transition. But the rise of social media just meant that, and the lack of any state support for traditional media, except for state-owned media, meant that social media came to dominate. And we see the kind of consequences that we see everywhere in the world. I think with specifically the kind of violence, ethnic violence in Rakhine against the Rohingya in 2015, 16, 17, I think obviously there's an influence between the sort of hate speech that might have been on social media, or that was on social media, and what happened. But I think we have to be careful not to draw too direct a line. I mean, in 2012, for example, when communal violence first erupted, there was no Facebook, there was no social media, almost no one was on the internet. And I would argue even in 2016, 2017, that the kinds of army operations that happened, the violence that happened, all of these things are part of a long-standing playbook. And I'm not 100% sure that they wouldn't have happened without social media and without Facebook. So there might have been an influence, but I think the causality and the accountability really lies elsewhere.
Mm. A hidden strand of contemporary history, which you mention in your book, is the fate of the other ethnic minorities, the kind of established ethnic minorities like the Shan and the Kachin and the Mon. Coming out of the 2015 general election, I guess there was an expectation that they would get their act together, that the NLD couldn't possibly do so well again in 2020 as it had done in 2015, and it turns out they've done even better. You know, they've not only humiliated the USDP, but they've also got a much stronger foothold in ethnically named states. What's your reading of that? You know, we focused so much on the Rohingya in the past 10 years, but of course there has been this subtext that you bring out of all the other failures, peace process and national integration. How do you see that coming out of the 2020 general election?
I mean, it's very difficult to generalize about what might have happened in these past elections, because we don't really have the data from all the different constituencies yet. I mean, it's clear that the NLD won a landslide and that the ethnic minority parties, as you say, didn't do nearly as well as they would have hoped, and I think many observers and analysts had expected. I think that, you know, on the one hand, you have in many parts of the country still, if not armed conflict, then the influence of ethnic armed organizations and militia on the ground. And we don't know what influence they would have played in some of these areas, or the army itself in some of these areas as well. I think we have to take a deeper look at the demographic changes in many of these constituencies, which in the end have become mixed constituencies, which makes it much more difficult for parties that are based on a single ethnic minority to do well in what is a first-past-post electoral system in Myanmar. I think over the past few years, though, we have seen on social media as well this kind of unprecedented mobilization of people around identity issues. And that's why I think many people had expected, and given the continuation of conflict, given the lack of success in the peace process, given a feeling, I think, amongst many minority peoples that the government in Naypyidaw wasn't showing any kind of real empathy for their grievances and their plight, that would then translate into votes at the ballot box. But it hasn't happened. And again, it could be for a mix of reasons, the demographic nature of the constituencies. It's also because this is an election that's happened in COVID, which has given the incumbent an enormous advantage, and which has made very difficult for smaller parties and ethnic-based parties to mobilize, to organize as they might have otherwise. But I think we also have to just say that, you know, I think for a lot of people, regardless of ethnicity, I think the support for the NLD is real, including within minority communities. And I think to the extent that many people still fear that we're not finished in terms of the story of the country's exit from military dictatorship, I think there are a lot of people in the country, rightly or wrongly, believe that it's the state councillor Aung San Tsuchi who's the only one who can really see through this transition and be able to stand up, if necessary, against any possible return to military dictatorship.
We've talked a number of times already about Burma and the world, Burma and other countries. And one of the themes in your book is your own engagement with Burma, in a sense, as an outsider. I mean, as going to the camps after the 88 uprising and being with the students, being a proponent of sanctions in those days, and then coming round partly through your engagement with other challenging situations at the UN to a position of engagement. Now we're at a very difficult situation as far as the outside world's engagement with Burma is concerned, in that what was that rush to engage in the early part of the 2010s suddenly turned sour, particularly in 2017. What is your advice for kind of those who wish Burma well, particularly say in the Western world, in the States, in the European Union, what is your advice for them? Now we've just had another set piece. We've had a general election, so it is a time to rethink and recalibrate. What would you say?
I think by far the most important thing I think that governments and people in the West need to think about when thinking about Burma and wanting to help in Burma is to be humble and to realize that, you know, whatever happens, it's not the West, it's not the Western governments that are going to micromanage political change halfway around the world. And I think it's not lost on anyone, least of all, I think people in Burma, that the West also has a lot of problems of its own right now. And that many of these governments, including the governments that have been the most interested in Burma or Myanmar over these decades, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, have a lot of political problems at home as well. And I think that's a way of also saying that I think what the West can do best is show by example. And I think if in the coming years or in the coming decade, the West begins to take a lead on issues like climate change, on issues of economic change, of addressing inequality, at home as well. I think these things will have an influence. I think the West still has an enormous soft power in a place like Burma. And I think the more successful Western countries are at moving along a more progressive agenda, at moving along in the direction of creating more sustainable, more green economies, I think these are things that will have a much bigger impact in a place like Burma than simply trying to micromanage change through, say, a new round of even targeted sanctions. So I think that's one. I think the only thing I would add to that is I think, you know, anyone who thinks that tight sanctions, isolation is going to help anyone, least of all the most vulnerable communities in the country, really doesn't understand Burmese history. And I think that the path to helping all peoples in Burma, or peoples like, you know, Rohingya, even the refugees who are living in camps in Bangladesh, I think there's no solution to any of these issues and challenges that doesn't go through change within the country as a whole. And I think more engagement, less isolation, and again, kind of leading by example and fostering the kind of progressive thinking in the country, I think is what the West can do best if it wants to help.
Mm. And as a former UN staffer, I mean, looking at that superstructure of international institutions, Burma now has a very complex relationship with them too, with the ICJ on the one hand, but with also a number of UN agencies operating inside the country. What is the future for that level of kind of international society as represented by the UN and similar bodies? What is the future for their engagement?
I think that, you know, there are a number of different UN funds, agencies, programs have been working in the country. I think some of the specific projects and programs do a lot of good. There are many good and very dedicated people there. I think UNHCR plays a very important role for both IDPs and especially refugees now as well. But I think that, you know, if institutions like the UN really want to help, there has to be a level of investment as well in knowledge and understanding the country that's commensurate with the kind of ambitions that the UN has. Meaning that if the UN's main ambition is to help IDPs in a particular camp and make sure that they have the right protection and humanitarian assistance, perhaps it doesn't require that much knowledge of sort of history and everything else. But I think if the UN sets itself up to bring about overall change in Myanmar, to ensure that it moves towards becoming a liberal democracy, then that involves an incredibly complex set of issues and factors which require incredibly deep knowledge of the country. And so I just think that, you know, what's happened over the past 30 years, or the failure in many ways of the UN over the past 30 years, is that on the one hand, Myanmar has been this kind of flagship of democracy promotion for the UN, one of the only countries in the world where the UN put democracy, democratic change at the front of what it was trying to do. But yet over 30 years, it's really invested almost nothing in knowledge and understanding the country better.
Yeah. In your previous book, Where China Meets India, you wrote about the neighborhood and highlighted this strategic location of Myanmar. What is the best way for Myanmar into the 2020s to navigate those two bilateral relationships?
I mean, I think one is that, you know, the instinct of the country has always been to stay away from alliances and try to balance big powers and try to be friendly with countries all around it. And I think it still is trying to do that. And I think it still does that reasonably well. And I think especially for the biggest powers in the region like China, you know, especially, I think, trying to maintain a degree of friendly relations without being kind of overwhelmed by the embrace of a much bigger country is in the kind of DNA of Burmese foreign policy thinkers and the foreign policy establishment. But I think that the challenges are now far different, of a completely different order than they might have been, say, in the 50s and 60s when these ideas were first created and first evolved. I mean, not least because countries like China, but also Thailand next door, really are not, in any way similar to Burma anymore. They're 5, 10, soon to be 20 times richer and more powerful across the board, economically, militarily, and in other ways. And I think, first and foremost, Myanmar, Burma's agenda needs to be to catch up with these countries as best it can. If it is, 10, 15, 20 times poorer than these countries, I don't think any degree of skillful diplomacy is going to help very much. I think it then loses its own agency in being able to be a balancer, to be able to be a kind of crossroads in a way that benefits Myanmar people. So I would put actually development at front and center of thinking about how Burma can best harness, make use of, and exploit the fact that it is between China, India, and the rest of ASEAN.
And one of the points you make in your book is the peace process and how important China is as an actor in the peace process. Do you see any glimmers of hope there?
I think there is some glimmer of hope. I mean, I think but I think we have to take the situation into its different parts. I think in the southeast of the country, along the Thai border, this was a situation, I think, after a lot of very intense fighting in the 1990s and 2000s, was already ripe for some kind of peace process. And there, I think, because many of the ethnic armed organizations have signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement and have been negotiating with the government, I think with the right investment and investment in general, not simply economic investment, but with the right compromises on all sides, but especially on the government side, I think peace is in a way, much more in reach than it has been in generations. I think on the Chinese border, where you have both old and new ethnic armed groups, and you have the biggest of all, the United Wa State Army, you have an incredibly complicated landscape that is fueled by continuing grievances of local people, many of whom have never been under the authority of any outside power, even in British times, but where China plays a big role, and I think where bilateral relations between Myanmar and China are going to be probably the determining factor in terms of where things go there. And then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, you have this new war in Rakhine between the Arakan army and the Burmese army, which has really exploded over the past few years, which is almost nowhere on the international kind of radar, but is probably, I would argue, the most important insurrection against the central government in a generation. And there we have no end in sight. It's a very early stage where feelings are very raw. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced. And there it's very hard to be hopeful that we can move anytime soon towards a political solution.
Myanmar has a disciplined, flourishing democracy as designed by Thant Myint-U and the junta, and endorsed by the people in a sham referendum in 2008. And I guess many of us have been focused on how the disciplined flourishing can be shrugged off, and the military yoke can be really made consigned to history, and it could become a democracy pure and simple. But there's maybe another concern now, which is with this sweeping NLD gain in 2020, Myanmar might be looking at a kind of South African ANC dominant party style future, whereby corruption, which is already something of a feature in the NLD, comes to infect that ruling party. And you have an illiberal democracy for a different reason, not because the militaries refuse to go away, but even if they do, no more military ministers, no more military representation in parliament. Even if we got rid of all of that, you may still have an illiberal democracy because of the course that the NLD takes. Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, in a way, that's thinking about what are we really transitioning to. So in a way, the problems of the past have been this pure military dictatorship. The military said that they were creating a disciplined, flourishing democracy, but in a way it was a hybrid system where the army would have constitutional rights that were preserved within the constitution. I think whether or not constitutional change happens towards a genuine kind of constitutional democracy or not, I think a return to the the old days of pure military dictatorship is probably one of the least likely of the bad scenarios going ahead. I think a more likely bad scenario is what you intimate, which is a transition to still, some kind of democracy, but illiberal, but also corrupt, dominated by a single party. I think, especially in the post Aung San Tsuchi era, I think there's the worry both of a corrupt establishment in general, whether it's the NLD or others, but political parties teaming up with others to impose a kind of unequal society on the rest is very real. But another bad scenario would be that doesn't happen, and instead, in a post Aung San Suu Kyi era, we see a much more fractious political environment that leads to a new cycle of violent or armed conflict as well. I think, again, the answer to all of this is to put Burma squarely on a different development track. And I think that is partly about addressing these issues of corruption and creating a more transparent economic environment. But I think it's much more than that. I think it's about really pushing forward a short-term 5-10-year, much more dynamic economic development agenda, which I think would open doors that have been closed so far on a number of different other issues as well.
So where's that going to come from? We've got this kind of gerontocracy running the country. We have a state structure which was largely collapsed by the end of the Thant Myint-U era and hasn't been fully reconstructed yet. There aren't the kind of domestic think tanks. There aren't the universities, the vibrant campuses that could be the source of many of these ideas. Where is it going to come from?
Well, I mean, if you think of it in terms of three doors, you have the door to political change, which was open. We walked through that. We got to a degree of at least democratic government, and we find the next door locked in terms of further constitutional change or closed and very tightly closed. We have the kind of door to ending inter-ethnic conflict, and that door has been closed as well, or it's very difficult to open. And on this side, we've seen horrific violence over the past years and continued ethnic conflict. I think the door to rapid economic progress is open. I don't think anyone in the country is against that. I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, no one is against Burma trying to catch up with Thailand or China or other neighboring countries. There's corruption, there's cronyism, but I think the bulk of the electorate, and also I would think good people in the bureaucracy and the army, everyone would be in favor of that. I think you're absolutely right in pointing to the extreme weakness of Myanmar's institutional capacity. But in a way, I think we have to reframe development as a way of building that institutional capacity, whether it's around Myanmar companies, whether it's around state-owned companies, whether it's around parts of the bureaucracy. I think it's exactly building that institutional capacity, which needs to be at the heart of thinking about development as opposed to simply FDI inflows or economic growth in GDP terms. It's not just human development. It's not just more education, healthcare, though that's incredibly important. I think it's building up that national capacity, because once that's there, the country will have so many more choices in terms of where it wants to go in terms of its future sort of economic and social vision. So I think that is how we need to think about it. I think how we get there is a different matter, and it's going to take a lot of political leadership and political will. But I think the starting point is a much different conversation about the future of the economy, the future of society, 20, 30 years down the road, when the country will be dealing with climate change as well as a whole host of different issues. I think the value in moving towards that kind of discussion is not just that it's incredibly necessary. It's urgent because of the rise of China next door. It's urgent because of climate change. But it's a way of also lifting Burma out of the box that it's in with all of these deep-seated and seemingly intractable challenges, and moving it into a box where I think much more consensus can be forged. And lastly, let me just say that Myanmar is a country of tremendous economic potential as well. I mean, Myanmar catching up fast with other countries is not necessarily a kind of a pipe dream. Myanmar's government has some of the instruments at its disposal to move forward on the kind of path that we've seen used so successfully in many other East Asian countries. So I think it's a matter of will, and it's a matter of the public, I think, being engaged in a very different discussion about the future of the country as well.
I've got to ask you about Aung San Suu Kyi. I mean, we already mentioned her several times. You have that very nice anecdote in your book of her meeting university students in 2018 and not talking about running the country or about the Rohingya crisis, but asking them about the novel and which is more important, plot or character. What's your judgment on her first 5 years as state councillor?
I think it's, I think as a historian, it's very difficult. I think when we, even now with this new, election results, it kind of shines a different light on even the very recent past. I think if we go forward 10 years, 15 years, when we look back, I think only then we'll really understand what role she has played at this time. I think that, what's clear is that she is not just liked and supported, but adored and trusted by tens of millions of people in the country. And that is an asset which has allowed the country in a way to be unified around a person, but also a kind of a political setup in this very difficult and fragile kind of period exiting from dictatorship, when in some ways the country could have fallen apart in 100 different ways, over these past several years even. I think it was understandable that in 2015, when the NLD and Aung San Tsuchi first came to power, that they didn't have the full panoply of policies and everything already ready because of the history of the past 25 years, where they had almost no room to do that, but also where so many of their colleagues were locked up or were sent into exile or who died. I think it's right that there's been criticism over these past few years that there hasn't been sufficient attention to some of the economic issues that I was talking about. I think that more could have been done in terms of laying out a progressive and new and interesting and dynamic economic agenda that should have been linked to the peace building or peace process agenda as well. But I think a lot now depends on what happens next. I mean, now with this enormous electoral mandate, I think we have Aung San Suu Kyi now in Naypyidaw and an NLD government that's much more aware of its surroundings, much more confident in its own position, or can be confident in its own position. And with this country's both urgent economic issues and economic potential in front of it. So I think a lot will be determined in terms of her legacy by what happens next over these next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. You've ruled out neoliberalism as the way forward for Myanmar, and that also kind of traces back to the colonial, exploitative capitalism that was on display then. And also, we obviously know that socialism failed, as you were saying earlier, in the 50s and still more so in the 60s and 70s. Is it possible to kind of capture what the economic path should be? I mean, is there a label for that?
I don't know if there's a label for that, but I think, as you said, you just mentioned just now, I mean, the political economy under colonialism was incredibly exploitative. I'm not sure that socialism in the 50s, we can say failed. I mean, that was a kind of a mixed economy. There was a big emphasis on setting up a welfare state. At the same time, it was an open economy that was open to outside investment and to trade, but with a big state role. And I think in some ways that was probably one of the more successful periods of Burmese economic change since independence. I think socialism failed in the 60s and 70s because it was under an army dictatorship and it closed off the country as well. So I think we have to kind of disaggregate what really failed and what didn't. Mm. I think, neoliberalism, I think in other countries, it's possible that a period of liberalization of the economy is justified and might be a very good thing, that it might unleash all kinds of new creative energies that have been dormant and unleash entrepreneurship and companies really helping to drive the economy forward. But that's not the case with Myanmar right now. We have this type of capitalism that's evolved, that's cronyist to the core, that is completely or almost entirely based on the export of primary commodities with very little capacity to do anything else. And then we have this urgent need to catch up with the rest of the region because of the rise of China in particular and because of climate change. And I think all of that points to me, if you also include the very limited capacity that we have towards a much more directed and focused effort, almost on a wartime basis in an emergency sort of way, to get the country at least to the next level of development and to also address issues of inequality over the next 5 or 10 years. And then after that, I think many different economic models might be possible. I think in this initial 5 to 10 year period, I think a big part of the focus has to be on developing some kind of new manufacturing base in the country. And by that, I don't mean foreign companies coming in and just using Burmese land and labor to set up their own factories, but Burma itself developing its own capacity to make things. I think that's important for its own security, as many countries are talking about in the rest of the world. I think having some kind of industrial policy in the way that many East Asian countries have done successfully, but attuned to sort of the 2020s world, I think is the way forward. And at least we need a good debate and a public debate and an expert debate on that possibility.
And part of that attuning that you often speak about in social media and the media, but also in your book, is climate change and the threat that poses for Myanmar going forward. So obviously in constructing that manufacturing base, that also needs to be taken account of. Could you elaborate a little bit on how it looks a bit like a circle that needs to be squared?
No, absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, Myanmar is a country, or Burma is a country that has done, or the people in the country have done almost nothing to cause climate change. But yet it's going to be one of the countries most negatively impacted by climate change over the coming, not the coming century, but the coming decades. And it's already happening now. I think before we see the impact of rising sea levels affect places like Yangon itself, I think we're going to see the change in rainfall patterns to the monsoon. That's going to be catastrophic for farmers in the country. It may make impossible farming in places where we've had farming literally for millennia. I think if Myanmar remains a poor country, it's impossible that it's going to mobilize the tens of billions of dollars that are going to be necessary to mitigate the impact of climate change. And that's another reason for fast development being really the top priority in the country. I think when we think about manufacturing, we have to think about, yes, in terms of climate change, the best predictions of what the climate may be 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and make sure that when we're thinking about major infrastructure investments, infrastructure planning, urban planning, the growth of cities, the placement of new manufacturing sectors, that all of these things are taken into account. So I think there needs to be a very close integration between economic planning and a hard look at what climate change is going to mean for Myanmar over the next 10 to 20 years as well.
Mm. And a wider challenge posed by kind of automation and all of that. I mean, how does that relate to the manufacturing plan that you'd like to see developed?
Yeah, again, I think it's a question of urgency and time. It's very possible, as you suggest, in 20 years or perhaps even slightly sooner, that with automation, the kind of cheap labor that Myanmar can most easily provide compared to some other countries, even in the region, is not going to be that valuable anymore. But the same is true for even things like Myanmar's resources, like natural gas as well. They may be much less needed because of changes in science and technology. I think the window where Myanmar can try to copy some of the successes in other East Asian countries and develop a manufacturing base that is meant at least partly for export, global markets, I think may not be that big. So I think, again, I think we have this very tight window of maybe 10 years to use kind of more old-fashioned kind of manufacturing capacity development for global markets, as well as the need to meet those tight deadlines of 5 to 10 years to be able to shift this country in a different direction. I think at every stage, though, it's really important that all of this is linked to a peace-building agenda as well, because of the political fragility of the country, because many ethnic minority peoples will distrust any development agenda coming out of the center, least of all a kind of a development agenda that seems sort of radical in any way or state-controlled in any way. So I think at every step of the way, it's really important to think about what bringing the state back into development also means in connection to the peace challenges, the interethnic challenges, as well as the democracy challenges in the country as well.
We've got a question in the chat about the Myanmar Peace Center and why that was not allowed to make a larger contribution to the peace process. Do you have a view on that?
I think that in 2015, when the NLD won the elections and made the peace process its top priority, its top stated priority, it was absolutely necessary to keep the bureaucratic capacity to run, manage, and advise on the peace process. And it wasn't necessary that the Myanmar Peace Center needed to be kept in the state that it was in 2015. It was very understandable that Aung San Tsuchi coming in would want to replace the leadership of the Myanmar Peace Center, because these are people who had been political appointees and who had been working closely with the president's office in the previous administration. But I think the option should have been to either keep the bulk of the bureaucracy, who were mainly young people who had just come back from abroad and who had received special training for this, or to create its own new bureaucracy. I think the lack of that kind of 150 person bureaucracy to day on a 24/7 basis manage the peace process has been a loss. But I think the bigger problem really has been the need for a more general strategic rethink of where the peace process needed to go in 2015 and today. And as I said before, to link it to a much more imaginative and dynamic economic development agenda as well.
I mean, it looked like Dorsu was very interested in that. She really prioritized peace. We were going to have summits every 6 months, and there was going to be, a lot of energy devoted, and a lot of leadership from herself and from her office. And somehow that ebbed away over the course of the 5 years of the first term. Do you think it's possible to resuscitate?
I think that the problem is that when we talk about peace, we're obviously thinking about conflict and violent conflict, and violent conflict in Myanmar means so many different things. I mean, it's the armed conflict in the different parts of the country that I mentioned before that are in completely different stages in terms of where they are and have been historically. It's also issues around bilateral relations with China. It's issues around the economy and the illicit economies, which are now worth tens of billions of dollars a year. And then it's not completely separate, but separate issues around discrimination, the lived experience day to day of many minority peoples and the discrimination that they feel. It's issues around citizenship and belonging. And then there's a whole third set of issues around what kind of devolution, decentralization, federalism or not, would make the most sense in a country like Myanmar, given capacity, given the challenges ahead. You can't put 1,000 people in a room and expect them over a day or a week or even a month to decide on all of these things. And I think you need a much more multifaceted process or set of processes that really take all of these different challenges apart. But you also have to just throw a lot of capacity at this. And I don't think it's about even 100 bureaucrats. I think it's a lot of different people, not in a conference setting, but working around the clock to try to unlock some of these very thorny issues that all of these different challenges are going to pose.
As in the River of Lost Footsteps, you weave some of your own personal story into the narrative of the hidden history of Burma, and part of that story is living in Myanmar, in Yangon for the past 10 years, finding a flat, Richard Horsey helping you out and kind of saving the day, and all of that. What has most surprised you as a resident rather than as an occasional visitor? What has most surprised you in the past 10 years?
I don't know if it's a surprise. Well, one thing is that I think, living in Yangon, you just see firsthand that political economy. In a way, I've been talking a lot about economic development and political economy and the way in which we need to transition out of that. And part of that is because I saw firsthand in the first 5 years or so I lived there, just how the economic system worked on the ground. I mean, on everything from renting a flat to working as I was as chairman of the Yangon Heritage Trust in trying to do work on urban planning issues. I think both the limited scope of state capacity, the corruption wasn't a surprise, but the limited scope of state capacity, the uncoordinated nature of state capacity, and the weakness of the state in general, that in a way it was a state that people feared in many ways because of the military dictatorship, but when it came down to it, really had almost no ability to get anything done. And that people at the top of the hierarchy were living in this world of presentations and paper approvals that often had nothing to do with how things were being run on the ground. So I think that's one thing. I think the second, more hopeful thing is that I've just been so incredibly impressed over this past 10 years by young people in the new generation in Myanmar. And I think you have a generation that was born probably in the, after 1988 in the 1990s, who've grown up in a much less isolated country, even if it was largely still in military dictatorship, who at least at the elite level have had the privilege or been able to be educated in international schools and in the English language, have had a chance to travel abroad and learn abroad. And I think we're not talking about millions of people, but we're talking about tens of thousands of young people who've come back and who've really shown a tremendous amount of both energy and patriotism and a willingness to kind of, work for different issues and for the country. And I think the future really lies with them. And I think my generation, I'm 54 now, is a generation that really suffered the most in terms of the country having been closed off. So I think, what comes next really should be in the hands of people, I would say, in their 20s and 30s. And I think it's for them to think about many of these issues. And I've said to them as well, and I'll say now here to those who are listening, don't listen to older people. I mean, just decide for yourself what country you want in 20 years and go for that, because I think Myanmar has tremendous potential. So I think a surprise for me has been, maybe not an entire surprise, but a positive surprise has been that hidden capacity that's, I think, there in Myanmar, and that remains to be used.
How's that going to filter into the political domain? I mean, it's the absolute reverse of that. When you look, when you take average age of the parliament that's about to assemble in Naypyidaw, it's not going to be 20s and 30s.
It's interesting because I haven't really thought about this in a comparative context. I'm not sure when societies kind of change from a gerontocracy to something else, when there is a complete shift in generations. I mean, in Burma we had that, right? So in the 1930s, politics was dominated by very early people, but then we had World War II, which was a big upheaval. And by 1948, the prime minister was the oldest member of cabinet, I think, or one of the oldest members of cabinet at age 43, and most of his ministers were in their 30s. And it would be great, I think, in many ways, if Myanmar could go back to that. I'm not sure exactly how the shift will come, but obviously there's just biology. I mean, people are not going to be around forever, and I think it's for this younger generation to really be confident enough to think through the issues on their own. They're the ones who are going to be most aware of the science and technological changes that are happening. They've lived in the internet age. That's all they know. And so I think it's to encourage them to rethink everything about the society around them and to push for the really radical changes that are necessary. And I think that can happen. I think it's a matter of their finding their own leadership in their own generation at this time as well.
One thing you very much bring to the table is a historical perspective and the importance of that. And also in your work through the Yangon Heritage Trust, as a conservationist, it's obviously not completely turning one's back on the past, but finding a fusion. How hopeful are you about the work of YHT in Yangon? I mean, it's clear that some of the really major structures will survive, Secretariat and others, but it's some of those lovely streets of townhouses that are under threat. How hopeful are you?
I mean, it's good in a way on its own that some of these bigger old heritage structures from the 19th, early 20th century are protected and preserved and renovated. But on its own, I don't think it means so much. I think the really important thing is that these heritage structures are integrated into a new vision of what the city can be. And I think it's integrating the old and the new, which in turn kind of implies or requires fresh thinking about what the city should be. And I think, especially in this pandemic period, I think the idea of city planning and having a more healthy environment and an environment with lots of public spaces and green spaces is something that might resonate. So I think that conversation about the future of cities is important. And within that conversation, I think we have to see the assets that we have in the city. And I think one incredible asset for Yangon are these hundreds of late 19th and early 20th century buildings. And I think if they can be integrated in the right way, it's part of creating a beautiful environment. I think we often don't talk about this when we talk about policy, but I think having a beautiful city is also important, not just for rich people or for tourists who come, but I think for everyone to live in a beautiful, green, healthy, environment where there's lots of public spaces accessible to everyone. I think there's a vision of the future that I think if we want, we can have, but we have to make sure right now that we don't destroy some of the big assets, including Yangon's heritage buildings that we have, especially downtown.
We've not yet dug kind of deeply into the religious tension that lies at the heart of many of the issues that come to the attention of the wider world, particularly Buddhist-Muslim conflict in Myanmar. We know about Wirathu, we know about xenophobic nationalism on the streets of Yangon and other major cities. Do you see anything being done from living in Yangon? Do you see anything being done to counter that at the grassroots level?
I think I mean, I think we have to there also disaggregate things a little bit. I think you have the long history of Islamophobia or fears of Islam that go back to the British period, to the 1920s and 30s, when this was first discussed publicly and argued by some as a big threat to the country. And I think that's been the strain that's kind of run through Burmese politics since then, and it has revived now in this more open political period. And so I think there's that specific issue of the place of Islam in Burma and the prejudices against Islam in Burma. The second is a more general sort of prejudice against, which is an ethnic or actually a racial prejudice against people of South Asian descent. And that goes back to the period of Indian immigration into Burma. And I think that's a very real lived experience for many people of South Asian or partly South Asian descent in Burma. So you have a lot of people of Indian descent in places like Rangoon, Yangon, or Mandalay, for example. And there, I think at the grassroots level, you do have people who work against it. You do have people who are friends, who intermarry, who go to school together, who work together. And I think there are local civic organizations and other faith-based organizations that do try to kind of overcome those divides. And I would hope that the government in the future would also lead very strongly on this issue. And I think in the same way that we have an anti-corruption commission, I think having an anti-discrimination commission, both on discrimination on racial grounds, but also discrimination on ethnic and religious and other grounds, I think would be an important step forward. I think separate from that, though, is the violence in Rakhine and the expulsion of Rohingya people to Bangladesh. And I think that has its own very unique history and set of circumstances. That's not unrelated to what I was mentioning before in terms of fears of Islam and racial tensions and biases and prejudices, but also has its very specific roots in the relationship between Rohingya and Rakhine Buddhists in Rakhine State, and also very specific roots in terms of how the conflict there specifically evolved over the past 10 or 12 years as well.
I mean, there are also some forces pushing in a less positive direction. I mean, the self-segregation that's taken place in Yangon neighborhoods, the fact that you used to have much more mixture within neighborhoods than you do now, that many Muslims have moved out and have congregated in a particular neighborhood. Many Buddhists have come in to take their place. And that sort of development is extremely hard to counter. But that would also be how Yangon is changing.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right. But I think we have to also remember, though, that if we go back 100 years, also Rangoon was a very segregated city, along racial as well as religious and other lines as well. So there's a history of that, which means that it's also easy to revive in some ways. I think if it's happened before and people want it to happen again, there's a basis, there's a foundation, there's a way for talking about it, sometimes in very negative ways, that also makes a slide towards that kind of much more segregated society. I mean, after all, as you know, I mean, this was a society for which the term plural society was first used by J.S. Furnival in the 1930s, and he meant it not particularly in a positive way, but as a society where people of different races and backgrounds mixed only in the market. And I think there's a real danger that Myanmar goes back to that kind of society. I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think in many ways, and this is why I think downtown Yangon is so important. I mean, out of all the different parts of Myanmar, downtown Yangon still remains a place of relative tolerance where people of many different races, ethnic backgrounds, religions are living together without violence over these past 10 years. And I think the right way to recognize and protect and celebrate that, and not tear down these multi-ethnic neighborhoods and replace them with 5 new shopping malls and 10 new residential complexes, and instead really help to promote the right kind of living together in these old neighborhoods, I think is an important example for Myanmar. And in a way, it's an important example for the entire region if it can be successful as well.
Well, thanks very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been absolutely fabulous talking with you, and I wish we had more time, but it's been a real pleasure and an honor to learn more from you based on your book, but going well beyond it as well.
Right.
I need to remind everyone that this event will be available to watch on demand until the end of the month, the end of November. and Chinese subtitles will be added in about 48 hours from now. The Hong Kong International Literary Festival runs until the 15th of November, which is Sunday, with 76 live and online events. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you also to the 150 people who've joined us to listen in, and to those who are going to be watching this this event online in the next few days and weeks. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks very much, Ian. Bye-bye.
Thank you.